All right, everybody, we were talking about free speech before and the need to exchange ideas and to hear things. And so it's with that I tell you to strap in, and I mean wear your seatbelt, because we are about to have a conversation with my friend Michael Malice. And he has written a new book, The New Right, A Journey to the Fringe of American Politics. So I suppose we're about to hop in and journey with you to that fringe for a moment to understand them, to understand the fringe of American politics.
Sure.
Great to have you here, man. Thank you. By the way, you are our first in-person physical guest in the Freedom Hut. So you can see now the Wayne's World basement is like the Four Seasons compared to what we've got going on in here.
I always knew you had a doomsday prepper aspect to you, and I'm glad to see you've implemented it fully.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to see that you make the most of the environment around you, because your shoes are made from clubbed baby seals, which is...
I think they're adult.
Oh, are you sure about that?
Yes.
He is wearing
Seal
skin shoes.
Seal leather. Yeah.
Seal leather. Well, leather? Or you're actually going to show us this now?
Yeah.
Wow.
They're vintage.
It's
You can't
stylish.
make it's illegal now.
Oh, it'd be illegal now?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's baby seals. So let's get to this, shall we? The new right. First, I want you to start with what is it? Because I used to come on the show, and I remember when Trump won, I had some early monologues that I think have held up very well about how get ready for the alt-right and white nationalism to be dramatically inflated as a threat to the country, and the 15 morons who will show up at a KKK rally somewhere are representative of millions and millions of... It's not true, but what is...
Okay.
What is the new right, Mr. Malice?
Well, I would just point out the 100 senators are supposed to be representative of 350 million Americans. So numbers aren't always a good metric.
That's true. And also, I mean, as I tell people in the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks, never had popular support, never a majority.
And also how many people were there in 9/11. So sometimes when you have a small group, they might have very dangerous...
Small groups change the future.
And have very dangerous impact. So the new right, as I define the book, let me see if I could get it exactly correct, is a loosely connected group of individuals united by their opposition to progressivism, which they perceive to be a thinly veiled religion based on egalitarian principles and intent on world domination via globalist hegemony. So within this sphere, you are going to have these white nationalists and KKK types, as you say, but you're also going to have all sorts of other heretical thinkers, and the only thing they have in common is who they see the enemy as and what they see the nature of that enemy to be.
I got to say the last part about a thinly veiled religion, it's a pretty accurate description of progressivism these days.
And
it's not possible to believe things that people are saying on the Democratic stage, for example, about the world ending and cities being underwater. That's a religious belief. I mean, no normal, rational person really thinks that that's happening.
Well, it's literally a religious belief, in that most religions have some kind of apocalypse end the world scenario. In fact, I tweeted this yesterday. There was an article from 1989 from the Associated Press. You can look at my Twitter, talking about how if we don't get this under control by 2000, major cities will be underwater. So this has been a claim now for 30 years. And, I was on Rogan discussing this. If these people believed it, the best metric for if someone believes something is look at their actions. If you say you like someone...
Be careful on the table, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's going to sound like you're pounding it. Go ahead.
Like Khrushchev, like Grandpa Khrushchev. If this were true, then we would see real estate values on the coastlines would collapse, because those people are putting their money in, and instead beachfront properties rates have gone through the roof, as you would expect. So they obviously, and here's the other example I always use, because I'm not a scientist, you're not a scientist. If there were, for example, a meteor about to hit the Earth, and in 20 years all life might end, the only thing anyone in the Senate or House or the president will be talking about is the meteor. What do we do about the meteor? The meteor, right? There's no other conversation. There's complete bipartisanship. The fact that we're discussing so-called kids in cages means that there is not a sincere belief that this is an imminent existential threat to your life.
This is a point I made about the most recent Democratic debate. You've got you have to be a Democrat now in good standing. There are a few things that you must say, or else you are out. You are voted off the island. Abortion's clearly one of them, but also climate change is not one of them. If you don't say, I believe in climate change, which is a very strange thing to say about what's supposed to be a scientific and really scientific/policy discussion. Why is it believe? Then why not? Why would you even use that term? I think it's seeped into people's minds that this is more than just science and discussion. But if they really thought these things, as you point out, then when Barack Obama was president and had not just a majority in the House and the Senate, but a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, they did nothing. They passed no legislation.
Well, Solyndra.
Whatsoever. Well, I mean, but that's,
right,
that's not an act of Congress to deal with climate change, right? I mean, it's so we're supposed to believe them now. And this is and yet if you tell liberals this, they don't react with, oh, poor you don't understand. They don't dismiss you. They certainly don't say, well, you're entitled to your opinion. They react with rage. Right. They are rageful about their psychosis.
Well, I don't think it's psychosis. I think it's something that they've been trained to accept and believe. And here's another counterexample.
You don't think that people do they believe the world's going to end or not? I mean, do the adults that think that Greta Thunberg running around, a 16-year-old lecturing us on trillions of dollars changing hands in the economy, really trillions of dollars of wealth destroyed, is it all just a scam? Do they know it's a scam? Like, I think CNN's audience, and I actually just talked about this earlier on the show, CNN's audience knows that the anchors are all liberals. They know that getting Trump is the game. They know this.
No, they don't.
I used to work there. I'm telling you, most
the
of them.
Audience?
The audience knows.
No, the audience.
They're in on it. As long as they're trying to tear Trump down, they're fine with it.
I think the audience, I don't think liberals, as you call them, perceive themselves as liberals. I think they perceive themselves as sane and normal. And much of the corporate media is there to present the idea that all right-thinking people think these very basic ideas. And if you don't think these very basic ideas, even Republicans like Ana Navarro and Bill Kristol, then there is something fundamentally wrong with your thinking, and it's based on either insanity or hatred.
See, I think I think that that's a perfect description of the media pre-Trump. I think that Trump has changed it in that now there's an understanding. I mean, you cannot be an intelligent human being with any sense of context or reason and think that CNN is not anti-Trump. It's not possible to think that.
No, this is why it's possible. I think you forget how complicated the human mind is, how good it is at compartmentalization. So they would say it's anti-Trump because it's pro-fact.
Because it's true, right?
And therefore, if you're true, it's going to necessarily lead you to be pro-Trump.
Well, this is why they did the whole banana apple thing. Remember
Correct,
that whole ad?
Of course.
It's like we're just being anti-Trump is to be facts. Well, but this has always been. That's actually even going back to Bernie Goldberg's book Bias in the 90s. It was that they didn't think they were liberal. They just thought they were correct.
Correct. Yeah.
And I guess they still do that. But I just can't imagine there's not a large look. We're talking about. It's funny with CNN. The audience is 1 million at the absolute top.
Is it really that low?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that tiny. Wow.
Yeah,
it's
amazing.
About
1 million. Okay. Yeah, Anderson Cooper has 800,000 people watching that show every night. I mean, the show is small compared to what you're used to doing at Fox. And anyway, I want to get back to your book, but see, Michael and I, we actually occasionally just hang out and talk about.
But I just want to build on one point you just made, which is you're acting. I think a lot of conservatives tend to think that this is somehow a recent phenomenon. And one of the things I talk about in my book is this has been going on for 100 years since the days of Woodrow Wilson. And we're all discussed in school about William Randolph Hearst, yellow journalism, right? How the media would foment Spanish-American War. And at some point, like they started being decent, rational, kind people. It's like, no, this hasn't changed. Conservatives have this belief, this kind of impulse, which
that they used to be like the left used to
hold
be
on,
normal.
no. In general, conservatism is the idea like things were better then, and now things have fallen away, and that's not inherently wrong or right, but that's just a kind of conservative psychology. And part of this belief is, okay, if things are really bad now, then they must have been better before, and we tend to think things were better before because before we were kids. And when we were kids, we'd be oblivious to a lot of the media's malfeasance and depravity because we just take it at face value. And one of the things I discuss is this has been going on for decades. And
it's now if I may,
go ahead, please.
I mean, and technically it is my show, so I'll do whatever I want. But if I may, the issue of transgenderism.
Sure.
I think you can put these things. You could plot it almost on an XY axis and look at this. I mean, transgenderism 10 years ago was the demands of the transgender movement were dramatically different than they are now.
Sure.
So the perception that things are worsening, if you look at it policy, but I mean, open borders is dramatically more common to hear from mainstream Democrats now than it was then. Now, maybe if you want to argue that there's some cyclical nature to some of this, that's a different thing. But on these issues, we are closer to the maximal position now for the left than we've been before. I don't see how that's
I'll tell you how you're wrong. Because if you look
on
at
transgender rights, I mean, that's not. How is that even possible?
Maybe if I can finish answer your question, then I'll be glad to answer it. I think you are looking at examples as opposed to the broader principle. Think about it like a toolbox, right? If transgender people wouldn't exist, is it your claim that the evangelical left wouldn't be fomenting, agitation about some other issue, whatever it is? They latch onto something every few years that becomes the cause du jour. And overnight, here's the thing. Let's talk about transgenderism, right? Overnight, the one thing, if you were caring about transgender people, was specifically transgender bathrooms. Now, when it comes to a transgender person's life, this or any of our lives, which bathroom you use is not at all the most important thing. Yet overnight, the message came out across the entire corporate press that this is the one issue and this is the one aspect of this one issue. That is not by accident. And in talking about maximal leftism, if you look at the 1940s, when the steel industry was about to go on strike, Harry Truman just blithely said, well, I'm just going to have the government seize the entire industry. So when you had Woodrow Wilson locking people up for having their political views, he locked up the third party, you know what I mean?
Yelling fire in a crowded theater. People always say this without understanding the context that it was people opposed to the war.
Right. When you had, before the Fairness Doctrine, you couldn't have any kind of real free speech in terms of radio or television. So it used to be a lot worse. Now, in terms of what they're freaking out about, maybe the positions are more extreme, but in terms of their control and domination, in many ways, they were much more hardcore.
So the overarching theory has been stable. It's just a question of timing because, for example, I mean, not to just focus, transgenderism is one. Immigration is definitely another. I mean,
sure.
There were, even in recent memory, I mean, the Obama administration was deporting hundreds of thousands of people, and now you've got Julian Castro on a stage and getting claps from people.
He's not on a stage anymore. And here's a fun thing. I have more Twitter followers than his campaign manager, so I really enjoy tweeting at him, asking if Julian Castro is having a whiskey with Kristen Gillibrand right now.
Anyway, but now he's saying that we should have taxpayer-funded abortion for transgender illegal aliens. So, I mean, there is that's, I guess you could say, within the confines of a specific issue, that is just the manifestation of what you're talking about, which has existed consistently for, as you say, over 100 years. Leftism hasn't changed. It's just how leftism gets applied in specific situations at different times. But I do think that right now on some very important issues, we are at on the issue, a maximal leftist. There's no further place really to, I mean, beyond open borders, where do you even go?
But it's always been that way. It's always been totalitarian. I mean, the whole fantasy of the progressives in the early 1910s was to have a country entirely managed by the so-called experts in Washington. And now we have these college-educated elites, and they're going to take over and have the entire country run like an army or barracks. And this was their fantasy, and they talked about this openly and brazenly. And this is why many of them looked at the Soviet Union and Mussolini with great admiration. I talk about this in the book as well, because when you have the free market and these small-minded people making their own decisions, things get messy and complicated. We want to have everyone the same, everyone in lockstep, and everyone regimented. And this is, again, that's why these issues happen overnight. And you have CNN and the New York Times, which is failing badly, promulgating them, and then everyone takes their marching orders, as they've been trained to do from public education, and goes on social media and shrieks the same things verbatim.
The new right. What are the components of it? I want to get back to your book, because you are here to talk about your book. What are the components of the new right?
What do you mean, what are the components?
What are like the subsets? The new right
is
okay.
What? There's a lot of different subsets. There are the kind of techno-anarchists who think technology is what's going to overthrow the state and liberate us. There are the white nationalists, and the alt-right is the subset of the new right, which thinks race is the most important, or one of the most important issues. Then you have, some really kind of fringe ideas like monarchism. We have to bring back the Stuart dynasty. You have these kind of quasi-fascist types. You have, of course, just the, broadly speaking, libertarians. You have the collapsitarians. Let's just bring it all down and vote further left and just rebuild from there. Then you have, the helicopter people. So there's lots of different groups.
And, Ann Coulter gave a speech recently. We were talking about it on the show. It's just reprising Adios America, which I think is really interesting that this doesn't get talked about more. Trump's argument that was the thing that he came out and said publicly, that all of a sudden everyone goes, wow, this guy's the front runner, was just the Adios America argument, effectively.
Correct.
Trump didn't come up with the idea to build a wall. I mean, this was just, he read the book or someone told him about what's in the book. I don't know if you read it or not.
Correct.
Yeah, and the point was that then all of a sudden he's the front runner. So Ann, in a way, kind of birthed Trumpism, or at least was there at the origins of it.
It's really funny because the previous president was picked by Oprah Winfrey, and the current president was picked by Ann Coulter. So this is a very odd country.
Well, I mean, given the power that media has and the omnipresence of it in our lives, I talk about this all the time. I mean, we are carrying around surveillance and propaganda machines with us 24/7. This is completely new. Speaking of things that have changed, this is new in human history in a way that even 100 years ago, obviously, was not even really something people could think about. I mean, when you look at Orwell's 1984, people love to talk about George Orwell. They don't really understand that not even Orwell knew that there would be a device where you were freely and of your own will essentially sharing all of your thoughts, all of your wants, all of your locational information, which ex-girlfriends or boyfriends you're looking at, with private corporate entities that can then also share it with the government at will as they choose to.
What I would encourage conservatives to do is also to read Brave New World, which I think in many ways is closer than 1984, because that instead of 1984 is the kind of the fist, and Brave New World is kind of the carrot at the end of the stick, and that the masses and populations are controlled far more through pleasure and being promised these kind of little bursts of endorphins as opposed to kind of the fear of reprisal. And you see that, I think, over and over in the media and in social media.
So the culture immigration component, that's something you talk about in your book.
Oh, yeah,
right?
I have a chapter on the divine misc, yeah.
Yeah, and what do you want people to know about this?
Well, her big point, and Michelle Malkin just gotten a huge amount of heat for speaking part of this and as well as some other stuff, is these immigrant groups are enormously disproportionately voting Democrat. So it's just a numbers game. If I bring in 3 million people who are going to vote Democrat from any country in the world, or 30 million people who are going to vote Democrat, that is going to have an enormous impact on election outcomes. So her point is, why are we importing Democratic voters as Republicans? I'm not a Republican, but she is. And to bring this up, oh my God.
You're an anarchist.
I am an anarchist, yes, sir. When people say, "Oh my God," everyone who comes here is citizen just like everybody else, and it's like, okay, yeah, you're saying that because they're going to vote how you want them to vote, and although ostensibly many people on the left will say, okay, you can't bring in everyone, they are very kind of chary about where they're going to draw that line. And her point is, why as Republicans are we bringing in people who are anathema to our worldview and our culture just because the New York Times is going to marginally hate us less? She goes, if the New York Times isn't attacking you, you're doing something wrong.
Well, there also are Democrat strategists, and you go back and they always pretend like this isn't the case, but they're quite aware of what the demographic change in America does for the prospects of the Democratic Party, which, I mean, let me ask you this. Is the Democratic Party a socialist party?
Oh, yes, of course. And so is the Republican Party.
Oh, look at this. This is why we get Michael Malice in here to say the things that nobody else is going to say. Why is the Republican Party a socialist party? Let's start on that side.
Because all government is socialism. You guys believe in socialized national security. You believe in socialized education very heavily. You believe in socialized security. You believe in socialized conflict resolution. These are all social.
So all government is socialist.
Yes, and you're just quibbling with them about how much.
So how socialist we are. Well, this is what's interesting about the debate with Sweden and Venezuela. This is how it always goes on socialism: is look at Sweden, look at Venezuela. Which one of those is socialism? The answer is both and neither, in a sense, because neither of them are places where the government seizes the means of production, runs everything. But both of them are places where there's a lot of government intervention in markets.
But isn't Sweden much more market-oriented in its economy?
It is,
the government's
actually.
not running
that's
things.
Correct.
Yeah,
no, but that's what I'm saying.
They have a welfare state.
They really just have a very large welfare state and high taxation, but there are sectors of socialism that exist in Sweden. And there are really the biggest problem that Venezuela had, among many others, was that they instituted price controls.
Yes.
And price controls was also a really, really bad idea for the French Revolution, but we'll get to that in a second. All right, so you're with Michael Malice, author, and can we call you a muckraker? Would that be?
No, that's a journalist. I'm not a muckraker at all. That's like
you're
that's like
you're
Sinclair.
not a journalist. I thought. Yeah,
that's
of
like
course.
Upton
I know
Sinclair.
It's Upton Sinclair in the Jungle, who's a socialist, by the way.
Of course he is, and he
actually ran as a socialist.
And poverty in California, in 1934, and lost.
Yeah, it's almost like these ideas keep coming back, even though they were bad ideas at the time. Where are you? Are you kind of an Ayn Randian?
Yeah,
person?
sure. You can call me Randian. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little bit because when people think anarchist, so I've been around some anarchists that do these crazy black bloc protests.
Sure.
And they're actually just really angry leftists. There's not. I mean, when I've talked to them, interviewed them, they don't seem to share any. Their whole thing is like the problem is Bernie Sanders isn't president,
right,
but they call themselves anarchists. I assume you have a slightly different take than that.
I do, but I do have a bit of affection for their for Emma Goldman, who was the big predecessor, who was deported by Woodrow Wilson and J. Edgar Hoover during World War I.
People forget anarchists were the big threat, actually, from a terrorist perspective.
They killed McKinley.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, they also tried to blow up Wall Street,
yes.
and the assassins, the terrorists, for a good like, what would we say, 30-ish year, 30, 40-year period, at least from the perspective of big historical events, they were anarchists.
The first terrorists in America were, Germans. Louis Ling was one of these Haymarket martyrs.
That's right,
There was a
threw the bomb in, yeah.
No, he wasn't. So there was a bomb at Haymarket Square in Chicago. People died. Some police died. They arrested a bunch of people, including Louis Ling. And when his defense was, I couldn't have thrown that bomb. I was at home building bombs. So he was hung, and now there's a monument because they were all pardoned by the governor.
So let's a little bit more on the book.
Sure.
Oh well, I mean, wait. You said so if everyone's, because I asked you, the Democrat socialist, you said yes. Then you said Republicans are socialists. But if everyone's a socialist, then isn't nobody a socialist? I mean, how does that? How
no,
is
the
it
anarchists aren't socialists because we don't believe in legitimacy of government.
So how would societies function if there was no government? Because all governments are socialist.
Well, they would function very well because you wouldn't have coercion. You would have peaceful self-segregation. You would have far less violence. You would have no taxation, and you would have less forced conflict. So much of the problems we have and there wouldn't be no problems, of course, but so much of the problems we have in a society is a result of government schooling, is a result of ridiculous laws, is a result of this.
Public school is prison. I think I saw you tweet that recently.
My tweet. This is my quote. Public schools are. You can laugh, but I just
like that. Look, I think
let me get the quote out.
Go ahead.
Public schools are literal prisons for children, and the only place many people will encounter violence in their lives. And I am not joking or being ironic at all.
No. I mean, but it's just my reaction comes from watching that in your timeline, the responses to this. I mean, people obviously completely freak out at statements like the one that you made, that public schools. Now, prison is obviously worse than what students are subjected to.
I don't agree.
Well, I mean, you haven't spent much time in a prison, my man.
Oh, sure, but my point is,
I have.
That's fair.
Right. Yeah.
But there's different types of prisons. Number one, and number two is the goal of public school is explicitly stated to make good citizens out of the children, which is barely coded language for breaking the souls of every single kid. So these are you cannot have enough contempt for these institutions.
Yeah, well, I usually focus the contempt on the people that pretend it's all about the kids who work for the public sector unions, which are so appalling that, going back to our historical discussion,
yes,
even the early socialists in America were like, I mean, public sector unions would be a crazy thing. And now if you attack them, they try to use John Doe laws in Wisconsin to ruin your life and your donors and everything else. But that's another part of the conversation. So you basically, you don't accept that. What is the difference then between Republicans and Democrats? And I know you're going to trigger some people with this, but I like it.
Sure. This is discussed in my book. The anarchist perspective, I mean, you'd have different perspective, and many others in the New Right would have different perspective. Many in the New Right are Republicans. The anarchist perspective is that these are literally, I'm not misusing this word, two rival gangs. And the same way that a gangster has a suit on and he's got a nice ring and people treat him with respect, there's no difference literally between that and the Democrats and Republicans.
I like the nice ring thing. Yeah.
But I mean, there's so much rarefied, air around what's going on in Congress, and you think about these people are thugs.
So if there's no difference, what are they fighting over all the time? Just who's in power?
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. Why do regular gangs fight? Turf.
Because what is your favorite line about progressivism?
I'm
sorry, conservatism.
Everyone's been
people have been stealing
my line and messing it up.
I want you to be able to say it.
So if you're going to quote it right, and it is conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. And what I mean by this, and I don't think you're going to disagree particularly, is that so many ideas in conservatism were simply the mainstream progressive idea 20 years ago. And now that there's something to be said for that, in the sense of like, there's not even this sense of self-awareness or shame that like, I used to think this, and now I realize this. It's pretended as if this has always been conservative all along. And it's a very bizarre thing to see so many great progressive achievements being championed by conservatives a generation later.
Give me people are going to want to know. Like
Civil Rights Act, gay marriage, public education, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. Bush had Medicare Part D or Medicaid Part D. I forget which one.
Now, everything that I can't think of one of the ones you said that I could say to you, you're wrong. Conservatives don't now say this is good, and that hasn't been. And I just think that, for example, looking at Social Security, that's just a function of the politics of power. If you say Social Security is a crappy program that's running out of money, that takes more money out, or rather that takes more money from people than they would make in even a very basic private sector account, you are never in power long enough to actually affect any change.
Sure, but
So
there's people who are not politicians who could say these things and they don't.
No, that's true. And but I think it's in part because the people that are supposed to, everyone pretends to speak truth to power, and it's nowhere is that more a lie, I think, than in the media, where everyone's actually trying to speak the truths they have to be in power.
Correct.
All the time.
I agree with
particularly.
you.
Yeah. No,
Yes.
look, I want, and this is one of the reasons why I like talking about these things in general, I want much more cynicism in politics, and particularly cynicism about people in the media, which I think now, I mean, I do think that these edifices of mainstream journalism deserve to be torn down in the absence of a real honesty that will never, because I mean, your theory, for example, and we slightly disagree on this, but not really much, on CNN and how the audience believes this is just true. I think their business model is at some level premised on a lot of, like, ABC News, another one. ABC News is as left-wing as CNN. There's really no difference. They try to package it.
I think it's much more depraved than merely left-wing. When we saw what happened with the Epstein stuff, this is not a right-wing, left-wing issue. This is kowtowing to power in a very, very depraved way.
I don't want to interrupt. Oh, go ahead, actually.
No, that was my point.
Oh, okay.
And I think that was a big red pill moment, what happened with Jeffrey Epstein and the cover-up, because people should be very, when I talk about, if it was just a bias, okay, people are left of center. That's, you know what? You could talk to people who are left of center. When you are engaged in systematically covering up things like wars, things like child predation, this is as demonic as it gets.
There are some leftists that really have made a name for themselves, even though they don't agree. You know, a lot of them are very anti-Trump, and they despise a lot of things about conservatism. Usually, the more traditional Christian moral components of social conservatism. But there are definitely leftists out there. I mean, Glenn Greenwald is one who
Michael Tracy.
Michael Tracy. They're these guys who just say
they're red-pilled.
Hey, do we believe in these left-wing things that we've been saying for a long time? I mean, I don't like the term liberal at all, by the way. I think that because really the contemporary so-called liberals are the biggest opponents of individual liberty in a political system that I know of that exists, at least in this country. And I think that that's getting harder and harder for anybody to argue against. But yeah, Michael Tracy and others. I mean, the Russia thing. These people are meaning the left and the media that has allied with them. They still run with this story and have no sense of what the ramifications are of really agitating for constant conflict with a country that really doesn't have to be in conflict with us in a meaningful way, does have a lot of nukes, and would be better off if we could actually find ways to cooperate with them where possible.
During the campaign, we were all told constantly and explicitly that Trump is so thin-skinned that when someone sends a mean tweet at him from another country, he's going to start World War III, and we don't want his finger on the button. This was the first question asked of Carly Fiorina in the second debate. Mm-hmm. And now we're told constantly and explicitly that Trump is a failure for not getting us into World War III. And there is no shame in this switch. And I'm going to make one more point about these leftists being anti-individual. In 1917, Randolph Bourne, who was an early progressive, was the only voice against us getting into World War I. And all the progressive lined up in favor of it. They completely destroyed his career. John Dewey would refuse, the big king of progressivism, refused to work on a magazine with him. And it was the idea that we're all going to get together and have a war to end war. And that he thought this is crazy. And of course, he was correct. The idea we're going to have a war to end war. So it's been 100 years when they've had this assault on any kind of individualism. This is not new. And I would encourage conservatives to kind of, realize this. Like the 1930s were regarded as the red decade because Americans intellectuals were in love with what, Stalin was pulling over in the USSR. Stalin. So, when people think, oh, it used to be good in the past and now it's gotten worse, it's like it was really... Henry Wallace, FDR's vice president, went to visit a concentration camp in the Soviet Union, and they put on a play for him, and he came back talking about how great it was. I mean, we forget just how left-wing and totalitarian things used to be.
We'll come back with Michael Malice here in just one sec. All right, we're here with author Michael Malice. His book is The New Right, A Journey to the Fringe of American Politics. He's here in the Freedom Hut with me in New York City. It's our first, you're the inaugural. By the way, it's going to be very fancy. We're going to get some plants. We're going to get some things, to
plants, there's no light in here.
Well, it'll be
some fungus.
It'll be succulents.
They need the light. They're in the desert.
Oh, that's it. Well, we'll get the artificial lights. I don't know. Producer Mark will make it happen. The war machine. Let's talk about this because I was in the CIA and went to 2 war zones, and I can say that pretty dramatically affected my perspective on foreign policy in ways that I think it should for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Today, you still have there's a traditional element on the right that when we say, hey, let's not have troops in Syria, which I could sit here and talk about dozens of reasons why we shouldn't, and they still have this, no, we fight the bad guys wherever they are, whatever the cost, whatever it means. And Democrats seem in on this too now, insofar as if Trump doesn't want to do it, they want to do it. Explain your feelings on the war machine.
The establishment's bloodlust for war, in which I include the corporate press, cannot be overstated. This has been going on, again, a very long time. The war drums from the media. We have to go to Iraq. We have to go to Vietnam. We have to go to Korea. Every single war, we have to. Everything in the world, this is the Wilsonian model. If there's anything happening anywhere on Earth, it is America's job to go in and impose Pax Americana. And the costs are never discussed. And here's the other thing, not only the costs for America in terms of American lives, American dollars, the costs when you go to a country and level it. I mean, if you've been to war zones, I have not, thankfully. I can't even begin to wrap my head around the existential trauma it inflicts on a population to be in a war. And thank God I'm privileged enough to not have to deal with this. So it is disturbing to the I mean, this is one of the reasons I like Tulsi Gabbard. Anyone who says...
And the left hates her, by the way. I actually kind of like her too, but they hate her, I think, for this in part.
Completely for this. CNN last night had a tweet that said... analysis of the debate, and they said no one goes after Buttigieg. And we all saw with our own eyes Tulsi go after him, and they're brazenly lying that what we saw didn't happen. It took 20 minutes for Tulsi, Tom Steyer, or Andrew Yang to speak at all in a two-hour debate, the 3 outsider candidates. It is shameless and it is brazen. And for a long time, this was the big issue for Obama. And we remember the George W. Bush years. Like, the anti-war left was a huge, huge thing. And as soon as Obama comes to office, it vanishes. And that is very, very disturbing. Historically, there's been a very strong anti-war element, both on the left and on the right. You know, the right historically has been... Bob Dole was laughed out of town for saying that all the wars of the 20th century were Democrat wars. But if you do the math, there's some truth to what he was saying. And thankfully, I'm glad that the Republican Party, which has historically been like the dad party, right, the party machismo, there's a space now to be like, wait a minute. We don't want these coffins coming home. We don't want these brave men killed in their prime. We don't want these kids, being raised without dads. Let's take a deep breath instead of having war being a first priority, having it actually be a last resort.
I agree with this, and I've been trying to voice that on my own. I had a debate at CPAC, for example, with Mark Thiessen and people can see it. It's on YouTube, so they can make their own. And I was just saying, I also served in these places for months and months at a time. And Thiessen, I thought at one point I would push him to a place where he would clearly have to establish I said, look, we have Boko Haram in Nigeria, you have Al-Shabaab in Somalia, you have the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines. So why don't we just send a 3,000 or 4,000 person military contingent to do counterinsurgency operations in every country, dozens of them around the world? And he's like, yes. He was a yes. And I sit here, I look at him like it's like we've learned, that's the height of the Republican establishment. Writes for the Washington Post as a Republican. I mean, he's a nice guy, but I was like, you're out of your mind, dude.
Can I give you a piece of advice? Next time you're in that position, ask him, have you ever considered the possibility that you're one of the bad guys? Historically speaking, Lex Luthor and all these villains, their goal was to conquer the world. And he's sitting there with a straight face, assured that we are always right. And it could be a bad guy versus another bad guy. That's what these people never think for themselves. They think, okay, this is objectively a bad guy. Therefore, whoever the opposite is by definition a good guy. We saw this in 1979, the Shah in Iran. The Shah's terrible. He's a dictator. He's got to go. And if he's evil, by definition, whoever's after him is going to be good, right? It's the opposite. Oh, wait, this one's evil in a much, much worse way. So, that is what they never think about, this kind of domino effect, not in the domino theory of the communism, but you topple one guy, the next one is not going to be some kind of Prince Charming. It might be someone who's far, far worse. Just like with the Tsar. Let's get rid of the Tsar. It's going to be great. The Tsar was objectively evil and oppressive. Oh, here comes Lenin. Oh, wait. Can we go back to the Tsar thing again? Yeah, it's they never play the tape forward.
What's the single best work that you would recommend somebody read right now, other than The New Right, A Journey to the Fringe of American Politics, which everybody should get, available in fine bookstores everywhere. But if somebody really wants to understand totalitarianism, what would you tell them to read?
Oh, The Black Book of Communism. So a lot of people on the right think everyone on the left is a monolith, right? I wrote an article for The Federalist about 10 books every conservative should read. This was on it. This was written by socialists. And they go country after country and describe what the communists did and how the levels of torture and abuse. I mean, just one mild thing, you know, the Soviet Union where I was born, kids were taught at school about Pavlik Morozov, who was a child who turned his parents into the cops because they were like selling sweaters. And this is taught in schools, that you should turn your parents into the police. I mean, the levels of depravity in these societies where governments turn every citizen into a spy on everyone else, where you could trust no one, where you live in terror when the phone rings or there's a knock at the door. Are they coming for me? Americans are thankfully very naive about the nature of evil. And it is my sincere hope, as someone who's proud to be an American, that in a sense that naivete can continue, that these, teeth of totalitarianism never reach these shores.
Michael Malice, everybody. The New Right, A Journey to the Fringe of American Politics. Mike, thanks so much for coming in, man. Good to see you. That's going to be it for the show. Shields high.